Don't worry, my sister giggled, her voice carrying over the string quartet. The trash won't mind sitting beside you. The heavy kitchen doors swung open and hit the wall with a dull thud. A waiter pushed a plastic garbage bin past my chair, its rubber wheels squeaking against the polished hardwood floor. The sharp scent of scraped plates and sour wine washed over me. I was 39 years old, a professional art conservator who spent my days repairing centuries of damage on canvas, and my own family had seated me in the service hallway for my sister's wedding. My mother, Marianne, stood right behind Brielle. She adjusted the strap of her designer gown, her face a mask of practiced concern. Now, Jocelyn, don't make a scene on your sister's special day. We just ran out of space in the main dining room. Several guests at the nearest tables chuckled because they thought it was a joke. An eccentric older sister being put in her place. Tears did not come. Running out to the parking lot was not an option. Pulling my chair out, I felt the sticky residue on the wooden backrest and sat down, placing my leather document bag firmly between my feet. "It is fine," I said, keeping my voice entirely level. "I will sit exactly where you put me." Brielle flashed a flawless, camera-ready smile, then turned back toward the main ballroom with our mother following close behind. Taking a slow breath, I looked at the table setting. My name was printed on a flimsy piece of cardstock, nothing like the embossed place cards inside the hall, and beside it lay the dinner menu. My breath caught in my throat. Printed at the top of the menu, serving as the official wedding emblem, was a watercolor image. It featured blue apple trees under a twilight sky. Below the image, elegant cursive spelled out the words, Eleanor's Orchard. It was not called Eleanor's Orchard. The real name was The Blue Orchard, and until 4 months ago, that canvas had hung in my grandmother's house. It stayed there until my mother and sister took it. Looking closer at the bottom right corner of the menu, I spotted a tiny logo printed in gray ink, Hawthorne Art Advisory. I had spent the last 3 months searching for that exact name, trying to prove they were involved in the disappearance of my property. Reaching into my purse, I pulled out my phone and took a clear photograph of the menu. Another shot captured the seating chart near the door, which also bore the painting's image. Through the glass double doors, I saw my mother watching me. She whispered something to Brielle. They probably thought I was taking pictures out of bitter jealousy, and I was perfectly fine letting them think that. A cold breeze swept in from the front entrance. Marcus stood in the doorway, brushing a few drops of autumn rain from his jacket. We had been dating for a few months, enjoying a quiet relationship built around shared coffee and professional respect. As an independent provenance expert, he verified the history of expensive art for private buyers. This man did not look wealthy or imposing, just a guest in a well-tailored suit apologizing to the hostess. "Sorry I'm late," he said, walking over to my table near the kitchen doors. The train from Boston was delayed. He pulled out the chair next to mine. A slight frown crossed his face at the smell of the service corridor, but he did not complain. Opening my mouth, I wanted to thank him for coming. Before I could speak, rapid footsteps approached from the main floor. It was Caleb, the groom. He stopped dead at the edge of the hallway, and the color completely drained from his face. He stared at Marcus. Then he looked at me. Through the glass doors, Brielle stopped laughing mid-sentence. She stepped away from her bridesmaids, her eyes locked onto her groom. Caleb closed the distance to our table, ignoring me completely. "What are you doing here?" Caleb asked. His voice was tight, barely above a whisper. Marcus stood up and offered a polite nod. "I am Jocelyn's date." I apologize for interrupting, Caleb. "Congratulations on your wedding." Caleb looked from Marcus to me, and then his eyes dropped to the dinner menu sitting on the table, right next to my cheap place card. Following Caleb's gaze, Marcus looked down. I watched my date register the watercolor image of the blue apple trees. Next, he saw the tiny Hawthorne Art Advisory logo at the bottom. The professional neutrality on Marcus's face slipped for a fraction of a second. The pieces began locking together in my mind. "Jocelyn," Marcus said, his tone entirely different now. "Strictly business. Could we step out into the front hall for a moment?" Caleb did not try to stop us. He just stood by the garbage bins, looking sick. Out in the quiet foyer, away from the music and the guests, Marcus kept his voice low. I cannot discuss the buyer or the contents of a confidential file, Marcus said, choosing his words carefully. But I need to withdraw from a provenance review immediately. The restoration photographs in that file show a blue pigment repair identical to one you mentioned when you told me a family painting had disappeared. His eyes shifted toward Caleb. If the missing work is the blue orchard, the two matters may overlap. Caleb clearly understands why my presence creates a conflict. We need him, your attorney, and the buyer's counsel in the same room before anyone says more. I turned around. Brielle was standing on the other side of the glass doors. She was watching us, and her flawless smile was completely gone. Brielle stared at me through the glass, and for a moment, the heavy bass of the wedding reception faded away. The tension in her jaw was not new. It was the exact same expression she had worn 8 years ago, on the day our grandmother fell in the kitchen. I had been sitting in a Boston coffee shop, wearing my best interview suit, when the call came. My mother did not say hello. She just announced the accident. Brielle was in Miami, taking promotional photos for a swimwear brand, and refused to catch a flight home. Someone had to handle the crisis, so I drove back to Providence. Standing in that sterile hospital corridor, I told my mother this had to be a shared effort. "We will split the days," I said, handing her a printed schedule. That piece of paper became a monument to empty promises. My mother and sister agreed to the shifts, and then they simply stopped showing up. A missed Tuesday afternoon. A forgotten Saturday morning. Instead of screaming about fairness, I started keeping a logbook. The doctor needed to know exactly when Eleanor took her medication, and my family's absences were leaving dangerous gaps. Writing down the exact times and dates became a habit. It was a quiet, necessary defense against their convenient forgetfulness. Boston offered me the full-time conservation position 2 weeks later. I turned it down, but I refused to fold myself into a martyr. Calling the gallery director back, I negotiated a remote contract for piecework. Eleanor had a sunroom at the back of her house, and I turned it into a temporary workspace. Late at night, while my grandmother slept, I cleaned centuries of grime off other people's heirlooms. Every payment went into an independent account. My mother visited once, watched me carefully swabbing a 19th century landscape, and sighed. "It is nice that you have a little hobby money," Marianne said, sipping her tea. "Something to keep you busy while you take care of the house." I did not correct her. My real work required precision, and Eleanor noticed. One rainy afternoon, my grandmother led me into her sitting room and pointed to the canvas above the fireplace. The blue orchard. It had been in our family for decades, featuring those distinctive blue apple trees. "The varnish is yellowing," Eleanor noted, her voice sharp and clear. Pulling on my white cotton gloves, I examined the surface. The degradation was minor but progressive, and I offered to preserve it. The process took 3 weeks of careful solvent testing and in-painting. When the canvas was stable, I flipped the heavy frame over to secure the backing board. Standard protocol required a physical record of the intervention. Taking a small archival repair label, I wrote down my personal lab code, the exact date, and my initials. I placed it discreetly under the lower right corner of the backing board, making a note in my ledger about a specific blue pigment anomaly that would only show up under ultraviolet light. That tiny piece of paper was just routine procedure. It was also the only thing capable of destroying a $1 million lie. 2 days after the restoration was finished, Eleanor invited Helen Price to the house. The estate attorney arrived with a leather briefcase and a notary. "I am transferring the painting to you, Jocelyn," Eleanor announced, sitting tall in her favorite armchair. My hands tightened on the edge of the table. "You cannot do that. Mom and Brielle will say I took advantage of you." My grandmother shook her head, her expression entirely serious. "You are the only one who looks at this artwork and sees a responsibility. They just see a price tag. It stays on my wall until I am gone, but it belongs to you." Helen asked a series of standard competency questions. Eleanor answered every single one with perfect clarity, identifying the current year, the president, and the exact market value of the artist's work. The document was signed, witnessed, and filed. I added the masterpiece to my personal insurance schedule that same afternoon. Helen sent a copy of the finalized deed to my mother for transparency. The reply arrived by email the next morning. Marianne wrote back stating she understood Mother wanted Jocelyn to own the painting while it remained in the house. It was a formal acknowledgement, sitting safely in my inbox. Brielle found out a week later and laughed over the phone. "You are going to bury this whole family in paper," my sister mocked. "Nobody cares about your little contracts." I saved the email, backed up the deed, and went back to work. Those white cotton gloves still sat in my workbox today. But the woman who had trusted me to use them was gone. 4 months after Eleanor's funeral, long before this wedding nightmare began, I had driven to the climate-controlled storage facility where we moved her valuables. My key turned smoothly in the lock. The metal door rolled up, revealing boxes stacked neatly against the walls. I walked straight to the back of the unit. The heavy brass hook was still screwed into the wall. A clean, bright rectangle of paint stood out against the dusty drywall, marking the exact dimensions of the frame. The blue orchard had been taken. The air in the storage unit smelled like stale cardboard and industrial floor cleaner. The heavy brass hook sat perfectly centered in a clean rectangle of drywall, surrounded by a thick border of gray dust. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to step forward, to run my hands along the empty space, to search the concrete floor for a dropped frame or a torn corner of canvas. My hands remained firmly at my sides. Touching the wall would only smudge the dust and ruin the timeline. Pulling my phone from my coat pocket, I activated the camera. The shutter clicked rapidly in the quiet room, capturing the stark outline where the blue orchard had hung for the last 4 months. Stepping backward, I took wide shots of the entire unit, documenting the undisturbed boxes and the solid floor. No signs of forced entry existed anywhere. The heavy metal padlock was perfectly intact, resting on the metal shelving rack exactly where I had left it. Walking back to the management office felt like trying to move underwater. The front desk clerk, a young man with bulky headphones resting around his neck, barely looked up when I requested the mechanical access log. He printed a thin strip of receipt paper showing the keypad history. Scanning the dates, my eyes locked onto a specific entry. The spare key had been used on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 weeks ago. That was the precise window of time when I was sitting in Helen Price's office, discussing the final probate paperwork for my grandmother's remaining estate. Sitting inside my car, surrounded by the stifling afternoon heat, I dialed my attorney. Helen answered on the second ring, and her voice possessed that clinical precision that always grounded my racing thoughts. I explained the empty wall and the access log, fully expecting her to authorize an immediate police report. "Do not confront your family or touch anything else in the unit," Helen advised. The sound of her keyboard echoed through the speaker. "Send me the photographs and the access log now. I will notify the insurer and we will prepare a formal theft report with the identifying details attached. Our immediate goal is preserving evidence and preventing another transfer." She instructed me to file a formal notice of loss with my insurance provider immediately. That single piece of paper would act as a tripwire, freezing any legitimate market transaction if a buyer checked the National Art Loss registries. Following her advice, I drove straight to my studio instead of confronting my family. The workspace was perfectly quiet, smelling faintly of turpentine and aged paper. Opening my laptop, I knew I needed a written confession, and acting on pure anger would not get me one. My mother always responded best to assumed innocence. I composed an email to Marianne, keeping the tone polite and unbothered. The message simply asked for the exact date Brielle had moved the painting for its appraisal, requesting the name of the advisory firm so I could forward them the restoration files. Hitting send felt like setting a quiet trap in the dark. The reply arrived 2 hours later. Marianne wrote back with frustrating confidence. She confirmed Brielle had removed the piece on May 12th. Furthermore, my mother added a lengthy paragraph insisting Eleanor had always meant for Brielle to have the artwork, casually referring to my legal paperwork as a temporary tax strategy. Reading the screen, a cold satisfaction settled in my chest. My mother had just provided written confirmation of the exact date the property was removed, and she explicitly named the person who took it. My phone buzzed loudly on the desk. The caller ID displayed Brielle's name. Answering the call, I did not say hello. "Mom said you were asking about the painting," Brielle began, her voice dripping with that practiced, sweet concern she reserved for her online videos. "Honestly, Jocelyn, You are overreacting again. You have your own condo now. You have your little studio. You are doing perfectly fine on your own, so you really do not need to hoard family heirlooms." She waited for me to argue. She wanted a fight about who deserved what, or who had sacrificed more time at the hospital. "Who has it now?" I asked. "It is being handled by professionals," Brielle countered, her tone hardening instantly. "People who actually know how to protect our legacy." "Who has it?" I repeated, keeping my voice completely flat. The line went dead. Setting the phone down, I opened a new folder on my hard drive. Naming it simply with the current year, I began building a definitive map of evidence. 4 columns stretched across the screen: ownership, taker, destination, fabricated records. Into the first column, I uploaded the high-resolution scans of the deed of gift, the insurance schedules, and the macro photographs of the archival repair label. Into the second column went my mother's email. I created 3 separate backups, sending one directly to Helen, uploading one to a secure cloud server, and saving the last onto an encrypted external drive. My family had spent years assuming my life was entirely contained within their walls. They were severely mistaken. The following morning, I drove to the family house to finish packing. Marianne met me at the front door, wearing a silk robe and a deeply aggrieved expression. She demanded I stay for the weekend to sort through Eleanor's vintage clothing. "I cannot stay," I told her, walking past the foyer and heading straight for the sunroom. My temporary workspace still held a few remaining supplies. Carefully, I packed my cotton gloves, my detailed lab notebooks, and every single folder relating to my conservation work. I placed them into a heavy cardboard box, refusing to leave any trace of my profession in that house. "You are being incredibly selfish," my mother said, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. "Your sister is trying to plan a wedding, and you are running away from your responsibilities." Picking up the heavy box, I walked toward the front door. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out my brass key to the house and placed it softly on the entryway table. I kept my own documents tightly secured under my arm. Walking to my car, my phone chimed with an incoming text message. It was a long block of text from Brielle. She promised everything could be resolved quietly, and all I needed to do was sign a document attached to the message. The file was named Family Collection History Confirmation. The message ended with a promise that the family tension would disappear completely once the ink was dry. Sitting in the driver's seat, I forwarded the attachment directly to Helen. My lawyer called less than a minute later. "Do not sign a single page," Helen instructed, her voice sharper than I had ever heard it. "They are not asking for family peace. They are asking you to legalize whatever they already did." Morning sunlight spilled across the scarred oak work table in my downtown studio, warming the faint smell of mineral spirits lingering in the air. My assistant handed me a small 19th century portrait, and we examined the flaking varnish along the gentleman collar. 3 more heavily insured pieces waited in the climate-controlled storage racks behind us. Our newest client had just confirmed a 2-year retention contract, guaranteeing my overhead costs for the foreseeable future. My hands moved steadily over the canvas, clearing away decades of neglect. Buying my own condominium 3 years ago had been the best quiet decision of my life. My mother always assumed the small brick building was a temporary rental, constantly suggesting selling the lease to help fund Brielle and her expensive lifestyle brand. Correcting Marianne was entirely useless, so my financial realities simply remained private. My family saw a lonely spinster hoarding a hobby. They did not see the thriving business, the loyal clients, or the solid savings account securing my absolute independence. The life they refused to acknowledge was the exact thing keeping me safe right now. 4 months before the painting disappeared, a local historical society held a restoration fundraiser at the public library. Marcus Bell stood near a damaged medieval manuscript, holding a glass of club soda and debating the true location of historical value. The man argued that authenticity lived in the provenance paperwork, the documented chain of ownership. Countering him smoothly, my response centered on the physical evidence trapped in the canvas itself, the microscopic layers of paint telling the real story. That single conversation sparked a quiet, steady rhythm of coffee dates and museum walks. The provenance expert possessed a sharp mind and respected boundaries, never demanding explanations for my late nights at the lab. We sat at a corner table in a quiet Italian restaurant on a Thursday evening, surrounded by the low hum of conversation and the clatter of silverware. Marcus observed the tight grip my hands had on the water glass, his expression thoughtful. "You have been checking your phone every 10 minutes, Marcus noted, his voice calm. My fingers relaxed against the cold, sweating glass. My family is dealing with a property dispute. It is getting incredibly complicated. Pressing for sensitive details was not his style. The man simply offered a sympathetic nod and changed the subject to a recent exhibition opening in Boston. Relief washed over my tired shoulders. "There is a wedding coming up," my voice surprised me slightly. "Brielle is getting married in a few weeks. Would you want to go with me?" Having him there meant having one person in that room who treated me like a normal human being, rather than a disappointing servant. Marcus agreed without hesitation, offering a warm smile that made the tight knot in my stomach loosen. The next morning brought a sharp spike of panic. Helen called my studio line just before noon, skipping her usual polite greeting completely. An independent art advisor was just asking around about international shipping permits, Helen stated clearly. Cold dread settled directly in my chest. If the canvas crossed a border, the legal battle to retrieve it would take years, burying the truth under foreign jurisdictions. We spent the entire afternoon filing emergency alerts with every major legitimate art registry and insurance database. My hands shook while attaching the macro photographs of the repair work to the electronic forms. Only later would we discover the export inquiries were a complete bluff. The requests were designed solely by my sister to make the fake transaction look more prestigious to the domestic buyer, creating an illusion of global demand. Returning to the condo that evening, an email notification lit up my laptop screen. Marianne had sent a scanned invoice for roof repairs at the family house. Her attached note stated that, since Eleanor had given me the valuable artwork, paying for the house maintenance was my clear responsibility. My mother wanted to pull me back into the endless cycle of guilt. Instead of arguing or explaining the theft, my reply contained a single document. The attachment was a spreadsheet documenting 8 years of caregiving expenses, medical supplies, and lost wages that neither she nor Brielle had ever contributed toward. The text of my email was extremely brief. All future financial requests needed to be routed through Helen Price. 10 minutes later, a heavy paper envelope was pushed under my front door, sliding across the hardwood floor with a soft scratch. Brielle must have driven over herself. Picking up the thick cardstock, my name was scrawled across the front in her recognizable looping handwriting. A yellow sticky note was pressed firmly against the back flap. "Sign the history confirmation before the ceremony," the note read. "Do not ruin this for everyone." Tearing the envelope open, I pulled out the formal invitation. Elegant silver lettering announced the upcoming marriage of Brielle Reed and Caleb Vaughn. Opening the heavy folding card, a familiar image covered the entire left panel. It was a pristine watercolor reproduction of my grandmother's painting. Printed underneath the blue apple trees was the title Eleanor's Orchard. Tucked neatly in the bottom corner of the image, barely noticeable unless you knew exactly what to look for, was the gray logo of Hawthorne Art Advisory. My sister had not merely sold the artwork. Brielle had turned my stolen property into the very emblem of her new life. The formal invitation felt surprisingly heavy in my hands, its textured paper mocking me with the printed image of the blue orchard. My fingers traced the blue apple trees, noting how the colors seemed just a bit too vibrant compared to the original canvas. My sister was not just selling a painting. She was rebranding our family history to suit her own narrative. Inside the package, Brielle had included the family collection history confirmation form and a scanned copy of a letter attributed to our grandmother. The document claimed Eleanor wanted her youngest granddaughter to share the family art legacy with the world. I read the text twice. The phrasing felt stiff, lacking the warmth my grandmother usually poured into her personal notes. Worse, the signature at the bottom was too perfect. I did not have any software to hack their digital devices, nor did I need it. Helen requested the original file, since the low-resolution scan was insufficient for any official provenance record. Brielle sent the file willingly, convinced that I would be swayed by the emotional weight of my own grandmother's fabricated words. Opening the file properties on my laptop, I saw the metadata immediately. The document had been created 19 days after Eleanor died. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to steady. Comparing the scanned signature to my grandmother's old birthday cards was my next logical step. The signature on the letter matched the one from a birthday card sent 5 years ago with unnerving accuracy. It included a tiny, accidental ink smudge in the exact same spot, confirming the image had been copied rather than written fresh. I decided to test their story. Sending a calm email to Marianne, I asked where the letter had been discovered and who currently held the original document. Marianne replied within the hour, claiming the letter was found tucked inside Eleanor's old desk drawer. A separate text message from Brielle arrived moments later, insisting the family lawyer had handed it to her personally. 2 different stories, 2 different sources, and 2 glaring contradictions. I saved every exchange to my secure drive. Why attend the wedding? The thought circled in my mind for hours. Brielle had already announced she would launch the Eleanor Reed Art Legacy Fund during the ceremony, using the painting to cement her reputation as the family's sole guardian. If I stayed away, my absence would be framed as bitter envy, and my silence would be treated as tacit consent to her lie. Helen agreed that my presence was necessary to document the public claims being made about my property. I picked out a simple dress, packed a thin folder containing the deed, the notice of loss, and Helen's contact information, and prepared to play the role of the silent sister one last time. Before leaving my studio, I looked at the digital photos of the painting's backside once more. I zoomed in on the lower right corner, where the archival repair label sat hidden beneath the backing board. The code was clear. I emailed the sequence to Helen, instructing her to prepare a formal inquiry for whoever eventually stepped forward as the current owner. Marcus messaged me to say he would be arriving at the venue late due to a confidential work commitment. I had no idea that his meeting involved a high-stakes valuation for the Vaughn family, the very people Brielle was trying to impress. The night before the ceremony, my office phone rang. Helen's voice was uncharacteristically quiet. She had been on the line with an art advisor who was handling the final provenance checks for the mystery buyer. If your client can prove ownership, the advisor had asked Helen, how quickly can she identify the painting in person? I thought of the repair label hidden beneath the frame, the tiny mark that only I knew existed. I only need to look at the back of the frame, I told Helen. The line went silent for a long moment before the caller disconnected. I stared at the dark screen of my laptop, knowing the next day would be the final time I had to play by their rules. My grandmother's legacy was not going to be a prop in my sister's play, and I was finally ready to prove it. Back in the museum foyer, Marcus's warning settled between us. Through the glass doors, Caleb had not moved. His gaze shifted from Marcus to the image on the menu, then toward Brielle. Caleb crossed the foyer and stopped in front of us. My parents are the buyers, he said quietly. The painting was acquired through our family fund. We need to speak privately before the ceremony. Marcus lifted one hand. I can enter only to disclose the conflict and preserve the record. I cannot continue the provenance review or advise either side. Caleb nodded and led us into a private bridal holding room near the back of the building. Brielle stood near the window, her white dress rustling as she turned to face us. Marianne hovered near the door, her face twisted into a look of immediate defensive rage. Caleb, what are you doing? Brielle demanded, her voice rising in pitch. The guests are starting to arrive. Caleb walked straight to the small mahogany table in the center of the room. He did not look at Brielle. He held up a thick manila folder that looked identical to the one in my own bag. I need you to tell me exactly how you obtained this, Caleb said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He looked at Brielle, then at me, and finally at Marcus. Marcus stepped forward, his professional demeanor locking into place. For the record, I am withdrawing from the review effective immediately, Marcus said. Until tonight, I did not know the disputed painting was connected to Jocelyn's family. I will preserve my notes and transfer the file to an independent expert with no connection to either side. I have been dating Jocelyn for several months, and I had no idea your family was the private buyer who retained my services for that specific provenance check. The room went completely silent. Marianne let out a sharp, ragged sound, her eyes darting between her 2 daughters. Brielle laughed, a brittle sound that did not reach her eyes. Jocelyn brought him here to cause a scene, Brielle said, pointing a trembling finger at me. She has been obsessed with this painting since the funeral. She stole the records, forged the timeline, and now she is using her boyfriend to validate her delusions. I did not let my gaze waver. I walked to the table and set my folder down, sliding the original deed of gift across the mahogany wood. I did not forge anything, Brielle. That deed was signed 6 years ago in the presence of Eleanor's attorney and a notary. Helen's firm holds the executed original, the notary record, and the appraiser's contemporaneous file. Caleb looked down at the paper. He reached out, his fingers tracing the stamped seal of the state. He looked over at the table, where the official seller declaration lay next to the deed. This declaration, Caleb began, his voice shaking. It states that you, Brielle Reed, are the sole owner of this property and that no other insurance claims have been filed for it. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for a truth I had been waiting months to deliver. Jocelyn, did you file a notice of loss for this artwork before we purchased it? I filed it 3 months ago, I said, my voice steady. The insurance company and my attorney have been tracking the registration codes ever since. Brielle let out a strangled cry, her hands flying to her face. She is lying. She was always the favorite, always the one who wanted to control what Eleanor did with her money. Marianne stepped forward, her voice dropping into that familiar, soothing tone she used to manipulate situations. Caleb, please. We are a family. Jocelyn has been through a very difficult time with the grief, and she is just confused about the ownership history. We can work this out privately after the ceremony. Caleb looked at my mother, then at the manila folder he held. He pulled out the letter Brielle had provided to his family's fund, the one that claimed Eleanor wanted the art shared with the world. He placed it directly next to the deed I had provided. Brielle, Caleb said, and the way he said her name made her flinch. I am not asking about feelings. I am asking about facts. Who created the letter that your art advisor provided to my father's investment fund? Brielle stopped moving. She stood perfectly still, her white dress looking like a shroud in the dim light of the holding room. She looked toward my mother, waiting for a savior, but Marianne had retreated toward the door, her face a pale mask of panic. Tell me, Caleb demanded, his patience finally snapping. If this deed is legitimate, then the letter you sold to us is a forgery. Who made it? The room felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of it. Brielle took a shallow breath, her shoulders sagging as the reality of the situation crashed down around her. She did not look at Caleb. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a sudden, sharp hatred that proved she had known every single detail of the lie she was telling. You think you are so much better than me, don't you? Brielle whispered, her voice losing all its sweetness. You spent 8 years rotting in that house, cleaning frames, while I was out there building a life. You did not deserve that painting. You did not deserve anything. I did not have to say a word. I just stood there, watching my sister dismantle her own life in front of the man she intended to marry. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, a heavy, suffocating weight that filled the room. Caleb walked to the door, his eyes hard and cold. He looked at me, then at Brielle, and finally he shook his head. The wedding is not happening, Caleb said. He walked out of the room, leaving the door standing wide open. I stood in the center of the room, my folders still on the table, and watched as Brielle collapsed onto a velvet chair, her wedding dress pooling around her like a broken wing. Marianne scrambled toward her, already whispering about how they could fix this, how they could spin the narrative to the guests waiting in the ballroom. I did not wait to hear the rest. I walked out of the holding room, my heart beating in a steady, calm rhythm. I had not come here to destroy anyone. They had arrived with their own destruction, wrapped in expensive paper and tied with a silk ribbon. I had simply held the mirror up so they could finally see the truth. Marianne blocked the doorway, her hands fluttering in the air like a trapped bird. She fixed me with a look of desperate, wounded confusion. Jocelyn, you cannot just leave us here. We are family. Can we not just find a quiet room and fix this mistake before the guests start asking questions? I did not move. I just looked at her, watching the way her mouth twitched with the effort of crafting yet another lie. The mistake was not mine, Mother, I said, keeping my voice low. The mistake was assuming that your love for family was stronger than your love for appearances. Leaving them behind, I walked into the hallway. The wedding guests were already beginning to stir. I heard the muffled sound of the string quartet stopping abruptly, followed by the low, anxious buzz of hundreds of people wondering why the groom had just disappeared into a back room with the bride and her sister. From the ballroom, I could see the staff moving with frantic efficiency. They began dismantling the floral arrangements. The seating charts, bearing that small, stolen image of the blue orchard, were plucked from their stands by employees who looked like they just wanted to be anywhere else. Brielle walked past me toward the exit, still dressed in her wedding gown, her face a pale mask of fury. She had to navigate around the very table where I had been insulted only an hour earlier. I stepped to the side, letting her pass, refusing to offer the satisfaction of a taunt or a gloating look. I was not the one who had destroyed this day. My sister had built her entire future on a foundation of stolen history, and all I had done was remove the support beams. My phone vibrated in my pocket, and I stepped out into the damp, cool evening air to answer. Helen sounded breathless on the other end of the line. "I have already sent the preservation notice to the Hawthorne firm and the Vaughn Investment Fund," Helen stated, her voice sharp with professional purpose. "They are legally barred from moving, modifying, or even opening the backing of that painting until a neutral conservator can verify the provenance labels. I have also spoken to Marcus, who has confirmed that he has transferred his initial findings to a colleague with no prior involvement in the sale." "Thank you, Helen," I said, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. "Do not celebrate yet, Jocelyn," she warned, though her tone softened just a fraction. "They are going to come after you. Brielle and Marianne will try to frame this as an elder abuse case. They will argue that you manipulated Eleanor when she was cognitively impaired." "I have the files from the deed signing," I replied. "I have the emails from the attorney. I have everything they need to see that this was my grandmother's choice, not my manipulation." Ending the call, I took a deep breath. The evening air felt clean and sharp. A few guests were already filing toward the parking lot. Their voices hushed as they exchanged rumors about the canceled ceremony. I watched the staff carry the wedding decorations out to a waiting truck. The entire spectacle was vanishing, leaving nothing behind but the cold, wet ground of the parking lot. I thought about going home, but I knew I would not sleep. My mind was already racing, calculating every legal and social move Brielle might make next. I reached for my phone, but a notification caught my eye first. Brielle had uploaded a video. She had not changed out of her wedding dress. She sat in front of the camera, her hair disheveled and her eyes rimmed with red, making sure the lighting caught every tear. "My sister manipulated our dying grandmother," Brielle whispered to the camera, her voice cracking with a performance of genuine heartbreak. "She stole our family legacy, and she destroyed my wedding when I refused to stay silent about what she had done. Please, if you care about family, you need to know who she really is." The video already had tens of thousands of views. Comments were pouring in, a flood of anonymous outrage from people who had never met us, who knew nothing about the storage unit, the deed of gift, or the years of missed hospital shifts. It was the most efficient weapon she had ever wielded. She did not need proof to destroy a reputation. She only needed a sympathetic camera angle. Standing there in the dark, I felt a familiar cold weight return to my stomach. This was not a legal battle anymore. This was a war for the public memory of Eleanor Reed. My sister had successfully rebranded herself as a victim, and the world was eager to help her hold the knife. I opened my email to find a message from a local museum administrator I had consulted months ago. He was apologetic, stating that due to the sudden controversy surrounding my name, they would have to postpone the collaborative project we had planned. The sting was immediate. It was not just about the money or the painting anymore. It was about the work I had built, the professional identity I had painstakingly constructed while they were busy playing the part of the devoted family. I turned my car toward the studio. I needed to see my own work. I needed to see the pieces I had actually restored, the history I had actually preserved with my own hands. Entering the darkened studio, I flipped the light switch. The clean, quiet room welcomed me. On the main workbench, a partially cleaned portrait of a merchant from the 19th century stared back at me with calm, steady eyes. I picked up a cotton swab, dipped it into the cleaning solvent, and began to work. Each stroke was deliberate. Every motion was grounded in the physical reality of the canvas. Brielle could lie to the internet, and Marianne could cry to the neighbors, but they could not erase the work that existed in this room. My phone buzzed again. It was a message from Marcus. "I am at the front of the museum," he wrote. "I know this is not how you wanted the night to end, but I am here if you need to talk, or if you just want to sit in silence." I did not reply immediately. I looked at the portrait, then at the empty rack where I had intended to eventually hang the blue orchard. This was the micro-hook of my own life. The moment where I decided whether to play the victim or the strategist. They wanted me to scramble, to panic, and to post my own weeping video to counter theirs. They wanted me to be messy and loud. Instead, I turned the lights off and walked out the door to find Marcus. We sat in his car for a long time, watching the rain blur the streetlights into golden smears. "They have the public," I said, finally speaking. "They have the video, and they have the sympathy." Marcus did not try to offer empty platitudes. He just listened. "Then let them have it," Marcus said eventually. "They are building their case on a foundation of sand, Jocelyn. Every time they tell the story, they add a new detail to make themselves look better. The more they talk, the more they contradict themselves. All you have to do is let them keep talking." He was right. Brielle's video had created a narrative, but she had also created a record. I had every email, every text, and every legal filing in my possession. Their narrative was a performance, while mine was a timeline. I watched the rain hit the windshield, thinking of the archival repair label tucked away beneath the backing of the stolen canvas. They thought they had outsmarted me, but they had forgotten the simplest rule of restoration. You can paint over a mistake, but the original layer never truly disappears. I was not going to fight them on their terms. I was going to let them reach the end of their performance, and then I was going to provide the final, undeniable edit. The digital assault on my reputation did not stop with a single video. Within 48 hours, the comment section under Brielle's post had become a collection of scathing judgments from strangers who genuinely believed I had preyed upon a confused, elderly woman. My business phone rang incessantly, forcing me to switch it to silent and leave it face down on my desk. One of my long-term clients, a woman who had trusted me with her family heirlooms for years, sent a formal email asking to postpone our current restoration project until the situation was cleared up. Reading her words felt like watching a slow-motion car crash. She was a kind person, but she was terrified of the public fallout. My mother and sister were working the phones, calling our distant relatives, weaving a tragic story of how I had supposedly isolated my grandmother to ensure her total control. "You need to speak to your family," Marcus said, his voice quiet, as he watched me pace the small floor of my studio. "If I speak to them, it becomes a debate about feelings," I told him, looking at the rows of paint jars on my shelf. "I cannot win a battle about who loved Eleanor more." That is exactly what they want. They want me to scream and throw things so they can point to my behavior as proof that I am the one who was mentally unstable. Instead of fighting on the internet, I spent 3 grueling days in Helen's office, poring over boxes of records that had remained untouched since the funeral. Helen remained calm, her focus entirely on the cold, hard facts of the legal timeline. We began gathering the documentation for the deed transfer, including the initial email correspondence between Helen and Eleanor, the detailed invoices for the notarized meeting, and the signed declarations from the independent witnesses who had seen my grandmother verify her own decision. The professional appraiser who had overseen the initial valuation 6 years prior still kept meticulous notes. He remembered Eleanor vividly, noting how she had pointed out a minor error in his draft and insisted on a specific phrasing to ensure the artwork remained protected. He provided a sworn statement affirming that Eleanor had been sharp, fully aware of her assets, and entirely capable of directing her own affairs long before any memory issues surfaced. Helen pulled a digital file from her archives, clicking open an email from my mother, dated shortly after the deed was originally signed. Marianne had written, "I understand Mother wants Jocelyn to own the painting while it remains in the house." I stared at the screen, letting the words sink in. My mother had known, documented, and explicitly acknowledged the transfer of ownership half a decade ago. She did not just know about it, I whispered, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. She witnessed it. Helen printed the email, placing it in a folder labeled for our upcoming court appearance. She explained that, while this was not a smoking gun for criminal fraud, it effectively destroyed the narrative of me as an opportunistic manipulator. It established that for 6 years, my mother had lived with the full knowledge that I was the rightful owner. The emotional toll of these days was exhausting, yet the evidence offered a strange, quiet comfort. My work in the archives revealed the truth that no viral video could erase. I discovered the history of the house, the logs of my own endless shifts at the hospital, and the witness testimony proving I had repeatedly begged my family to share the responsibility of caring for my grandmother. Brielle had rarely visited, yet she had always been the first to show up whenever a photographer arrived, ensuring there were plenty of images of her posing with Eleanor to suggest a close, loving bond. My lawyer's office seemed to operate in a different reality from the loud, aggressive world on my phone. We looked at the metadata from the forged letter, which had been generated on a company server belonging to my sister's media agency. The expert report was clear. It confirmed that the signature was a digital copy, likely pulled from that old birthday card I had seen months ago. The trail of digital breadcrumbs led straight back to Brielle's own computer. "This is not just a civil property dispute anymore," Helen remarked, her tone devoid of its usual caution. "If the insurance company or the Vaughn family reports this to the local authorities, it crosses the line into serious criminal fraud. The fabrication of documents to facilitate an illegal sale is a felony." I felt the shift in the air. The power dynamic had inverted. They had believed I was a soft target, someone who would hide in shame and let them rewrite the history of my own life. They had underestimated the power of a meticulous record keeper. As I prepared to leave the office, Helen handed me the final set of bank disclosures we had forced them to produce during the discovery phase. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning the rows of numbers until they landed on a specific transaction string. The money from the sale of the painting had not just gone to Brielle's wedding and her new apartment. A substantial portion had been funneled to an account in my mother's name, with a memo clearly marked as house repairs. The room spun for a split second. My mother had not been protecting Brielle from the fallout of the sale. She had been a silent partner in the crime, taking her share of the spoils and waiting for the dust to settle. She had watched me mourn my grandmother, watched me struggle to keep my business afloat, and watched me get dragged through the mud on social media, all while sitting on the stolen money. Helen looked at me, her expression grim but resolute. "Your mother was not protecting Brielle after the sale, Jocelyn. She was paid from it." I tucked the folder into my bag and walked out into the cool evening air. The city lights were blurry through the rain, but for the first time in months, I was not looking for a way to hide. I was looking for the right place to file the next page of this history. 3 months after the wedding, following the preservation order and the first round of discovery, the painting was transferred to a neutral storage facility for a court-authorized inspection. A neutral conservator, counsel for every party, a videographer, and a retired judge serving as mediator were present. Every movement was captured on video, the steady hum of the camera's recording light the only sound in the room. When the specialist finally gripped the edge of the heavy frame and began to undo the sealed backing, the tension in my chest became almost impossible to bear. He moved with agonizing slowness, peeling away the thick paper seal to reveal the rough, wood-covered back of the original canvas. My breath hitched. There, tucked neatly in the lower right corner, sat the small archival repair label I had placed years ago. The expert leaned in, his flashlight cutting through the dim room to illuminate the unique, handwritten code I had recorded in my lab ledger. He checked the number against his clipboard and nodded toward the mediator, his movements precise and clinical. "The identification is confirmed," the specialist said, his voice ringing clearly across the quiet room. My mother and sister were seated on the other side of the sterile table, their faces pale and drawn. Brielle looked as if she had not slept since the wedding was canceled, while Marianne stared at her hands, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The art advisor representing Hawthorne Art Advisory provided the rest of the documentation, placing the fake seller declaration and the fraudulent letter on the table. Brielle insisted on the quick turnaround. The advisor stated, his tone cold and detached. She specifically demanded that we finalize the transfer before the family tension reached a point of no return. Marianne stood up, her composure finally shattering. "I knew nothing about the letter. Brielle told me the funds were a gift from the family foundation." Brielle let out a harsh, jagged laugh, spinning around to face our mother. You signed the transfer paperwork. You took your share, mother. Do not pretend you were not checking the account every single day to see if the money for the house repairs had cleared. The mediator signaled for them to stop, but both statements had already been recorded. They were no longer a united front. Their attorneys requested separate rooms, and the rest of the day became a negotiation conducted while the neutral conservator finalized the inspection report. 2 weeks later, the parties signed a settlement rescinding the sale. The Vaughn Fund recovered the purchase price and its documented fees. Marianne returned the money transferred for the house repairs, and the court entered a consent judgment confirming my ownership of the Blue Orchard. The settlement did not end the separate criminal referral based on the forged letter and seller declaration. Brielle leaned across the table as the lawyers began packing their briefcases. You have your painting back now. Why isn't that enough? Why are you still pushing for the criminal investigation? I looked at her, seeing the desperation she still carried for a life she had tried to build on a foundation of theft. I thought about the hours I spent restoring the work, the way my grandmother's voice had been stolen, and the way they had tried to make their version of history the only one the world would know. Because you did not just steal a painting, I said, my voice steady and quiet. You tried to make your lie the official history. Before I could walk out, Helen leaned in and whispered that the insurance company and the Vaughn family had already transferred all the forged documents to the district attorney. The legal process was no longer in our hands. I left the room, the scent of turpentine and old paper waiting for me at the studio, knowing the truth was finally written in stone. 9 months had passed since the mediation, and the world had moved on to newer, louder scandals. Brielle received her sentence on a Tuesday afternoon. The judge ordered her to complete 1 year of supervised probation, pay full restitution to the investment fund, and perform 300 hours of community service at a local youth center. Her social media presence had been stripped away, her brand contracts terminated, and the professional blacklist ensured she would never again influence the high-end art market. She looked smaller, somehow, sitting at the defense table in a plain navy blazer, stripped of the elaborate costumes she once used to command attention. Caleb Vaughn had vanished from our lives entirely. He had not returned to any of them, choosing instead to sever all ties and quietly move his firm to a different state. Marianne suffered a different, slower sort of erosion. Without the funds from the sale and the prestige of Brielle's wedding to bolster her status, she was forced to sell the family vacation home. She was removed from the local art council board after the Provenance fraud became public record. My mother still had a place to live, but her influence over the neighborhood, the church, and our family was gone. She was now just a woman living alone, paying for her own mistakes. They had stopped speaking to one another during the final weeks of the trial, each blaming the other for the collapse of their shared scheme. I refused to mediate their decline. When Marianne arrived at my studio doorstep one rainy afternoon, looking exhausted and carrying a stack of unpaid utility bills, I did not invite her inside. I have the painting back, Jocelyn, my mother said, her voice thin and reedy. Do you not think you have punished us enough? I am not the one who punished you, I said, meeting her gaze until she finally looked away. I want you to understand that the things I sacrificed never became yours. She asked for money. She asked for help moving her remaining furniture. I gave her the address of a local social services agency that offered assistance for seniors and closed the door. I had no hate left for them, only a profound, hollow clarity. The Blue Orchard now hung in the main gallery of the regional museum, secured on a long-term loan. The provenance records had been fully corrected, documenting the gift, the conservation process, and the successful recovery of the work after the attempted fraud. Beside the frame, a simple, dignified plaque read, "Restored and preserved by Jocelyn Reed. On long-term loan from the Jocelyn Reed Collection, in memory of Eleanor Reed." Brielle's name existed only in the dense, private files of the criminal court, not on the wall of a museum. My studio hummed with a renewed, steady energy. Clients returned once the official court records confirmed my professional integrity. I hired a full-time assistant, a young woman with a sharp eye for color matching and a genuine respect for the history embedded in canvas. Marcus remained a constant, grounding presence. He did not move into my condo. nor did he make grand promises that felt like chains. We spent our evenings in the studio, sitting among the drying canvases, talking about light, texture, and the strange, stubborn beauty of things that had been saved from ruin. Walking into my condo late that night, I placed my studio keys on the side table next to the house keys. The metal rings clicked softly against the wood. No member of my family possessed a copy of those keys anymore. There were no hidden wires, no secret expectations, and no one waiting to claim a piece of my life. An email from a local university student waited in my inbox, asking for advice on how to navigate a career in art conservation. I opened my planner and blocked out 2 hours for the following week to meet her. The act of helping felt different now. It was no longer a default setting or a burden I carried because I was the oldest child. It was a choice I made because I wanted to. Standing by the window, I watched the city lights flicker to life. I remembered that folding chair, the one positioned next to the trash bin in the hallway of the wedding venue. That evening had been the final time anyone had tried to decide where I belonged. I locked the front door, checked the deadbolt, and finally understood that no one would ever choose my place again. You might feel like the person who always says yes, the one who carries the weight for everyone else because it feels like the kind thing to do. But remember that your sacrifices do not grant other people the right to treat your life like their personal property. Real love is not built on what you can give up, but on the respect you demand for your own boundaries. When you spend your years making yourself small to keep the peace, you aren't protecting the people you love. You are only teaching them that your time, your hard work, and your dreams have no value. It is not selfish to protect what you have built, and it is not a betrayal to prioritize your own stability. You deserve to be the primary author of your own history, rather than a supporting character in someone else's manufactured narrative. Do not wait for a crisis to realize that your worth was never something you needed to earn through exhaustion. Standing up for yourself is the most difficult work you will ever do, but the peace of mind you find on the other side is worth every uncomfortable conversation. Take a moment today to look at the life you are living and ask yourself, if you were not afraid of what people might say or how they might react, which parts of your world would you reclaim for yourself right now? You are the only person who can decide where you truly belong, and it is time you start making that choice for yourself instead of waiting for someone else to point to the seat by the trash.